Well, joining me now, Danielle Moodie Mills, host of WokeAF Daily and the Democracy-ish podcast, Don Calloway, former campaign aide for Deval Patrick, and Susan Del Percio, MSNBC political analyst and Republican strategist. Good to have all three of you. Danielle, I'm going to start with you on this one. What do you make of what James Carville said there? Is it political suicide for Democrats potentially nominating Sanders?
No, I don't think that it's political suicide. I think that what it's showing is that there is a deep fracture within the Democratic Party. There are folks that want us to continue along with the moderates and centrists, and then there are people that recognize that America needs an overhaul, that our political system actually needs an overhaul right now, and Bernie Sanders represents that overhaul. He is talking about big, substantive, ideological change, and young people who, frankly, are struggling in this country are grasping onto what he's saying in a very big way.
You know, Susan, the argument by the establishment Democrats that Bernie can't win, didn't Republicans say the same thing about Donald Trump in 2016?
They sure did. But there is one different dynamic that we're looking at right now, and it's whoever the Democrat nominee is, they will not have the same baggage as Hillary Clinton. And it's not a knock against Hillary Clinton, it's just a reality. She had one of the highest negative and untrustworthy numbers, only to Donald Trump in 2016. But, you know, and to Danielle's point, there's never a good time for a revolution if you're the establishment. It just doesn't work out that way. And if that's where the party is going to go, so be it. But it does come with consequences. And I think what James Carville was talking about, and what someone like me who's worked in districts that are swing districts, is that it will be very hard to keep those swing districts, especially in the House, when you have a candidate that is for open borders, is for taking away health care from their private insurance from 150 million people, especially those in the suburbs, and you're going to provide a lot of free stuff while all these people in the suburbs are trying to make ends meet for their children. So it's not necessarily, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but that is the reality that you have to face. If you have a revolution, there are consequences.
Look, to this revolution time that both you ladies are talking about, Don, let's look at what Bernie Sanders tweeted on Friday. And he wrote, "I've got news for the Republican establishment. I've got news for the Democratic establishment. They can't stop us." So this whole anti-establishment strategy, it's proven fruitful because Sanders has gained supporters here. But when it comes time to win the election, won't he need the so-called Democratic establishment?
Of course he will, and he's going to have the support of Democrats writ large who just decide to do the pragmatic thing and vote for the Democrat, or even just hold their nose and vote to get Trump up out of there, which is ultimately all of our goals. You know, Alex, since it's Sunday, there's always a word from the Lord. I believe the Gospel of Mark talks about putting new wine in old wineskins, and it ultimately won't work. Eventually they'll burst. Basically, that's the existential dilemma that the Democratic Party is facing right now. You have new young voters who have come up under the idea of Barack Obama as president and him being a centrist. Now the Bernie revolution happens, and the old wineskins are the Democratic Party, represented by James Carville. The mix simply won't work. We're going to have to find a new establishment. There's going to be new leaders and new operatives that step up from this new generation of folks. And James Carville simply, you know, no personal diss to him, but him more as a personification of those old wineskins, the past of the party. He will never embrace a Bernie, but what he doesn't realize is the same thing that happened with the Republican Party in 2016, that the Bernies and the Trumps of the world have tapped into something that is happening outside of the Acela corridor, outside of the political chattering class, and we as Democrats simply were not ready for the movement that Bernie built. But he is winning this thing fair and square. The question is not whether Bernie will win this nomination. It's his nomination. The question for Democrats is whether or not this is Bernie's party as of 2020 going forward.
Look, you're calling James Carville basically old school, and if you look who breaks for Bernie, it is the younger generation by a long shot, and the older generation, certainly just anecdotally and what we got from the exit polls in Nevada, they tended to vote more for Joe Biden. But as soon as you look at these results, Bernie Sanders has 47%. But then if you combine Biden, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, all of their percentages add up to 39%. And we should say there's only 50% reporting at this point. But at this point, you have these three candidates splitting the moderate vote. So does that in turn boost Sanders?
Well, it depends. And we also have to, there's one thing I'd just like to point out when you talk about the older voters and the younger voters. The difference that we're seeing in this cycle so far, now granted it's only the third contest, is that the younger voters this time are showing up. Usually the establishment relies on them not showing up, and that's why they tend to be able to hold in that moderate zone, because they play to older voters. If the younger folks show up, then it is no longer the party of the establishment. It is that revolution. But the question is for Bernie Sanders is, can he break more than 35% of the delegate count going into Super Tuesday, or I should say Super Duper Tuesday, which is on March 17th, which is I'm calling it, because it is another critical context where 15% of the delegates will be up and finally putting the delegate count over 50%. So that's going to be critical. But it's, to me, looking towards what happens on Tuesday. Will the Democrats, the other Democrats, say, okay, this strategy is not working for me, we need to go after Bernie Sanders?
Let's take a look at a candidate who wasn't on the ballot in Nevada, and that being Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And he sat down with my colleague, Reverend Al, for an exclusive interview, and here's some of what he said.
The stop and frisk, you've apologized, you said you've regretted it. How do we repair some of the damage? Is this what you're working with people?
I think part of the answer is I've sat down with groups of clergy and business people, African Americans mostly, and asked their advice and asked for forgiveness, but listened to what they had to say, and everybody's got different views. I think what is clear is we had a policy. I was trying to stop 650 murders in New York City. The policy got carried away, and when I realized it, stopped it, cut 95% of it, and then apologized. I've tried to meet with people who have been stopped and people who their friends have been stopped to learn what it's like. You know, I never had the experience, and my daughters were never stopped, so I can't tell you that I was that close, and that's what I'm trying to fix.
Danielle, look, I've spoken with you before and gotten your sense. You think that is a wholly insufficient answer there. But what do you need to hear from Mike Bloomberg to potentially throw support by him?
I mean, look, I'm listening to that, and I just hear how disingenuous it is. Like, I had no idea what it was like to be stopped. Of course you wouldn't, because you were targeting Black and Latino men. And I think that, honestly, what I want to hear from Mike Bloomberg is the truth. We went forward with this policy. The only reason why we stopped it is because of the federal government and because of all of the court cases that came up that told us it was unconstitutional to racially profile people. And at the end of the day, now that I'm going after the presidency, I'm looking at this and I'm saying to myself, yeah, it was wrong and we need to move forward. But I want to see policies that Michael Bloomberg is going to put forward for the African American community. I've constantly said that the only person in this race that has a really good social justice and racial framework is Elizabeth Warren. She's the only person that talks about Black people when it's not a quote unquote Black issue, right? She talks about the effects of climate change on marginalized communities, on people of color. She talks about that as it pertains to health care and Black mothers dying at a higher rate than white mothers. And so I want Bloomberg to have a much better racial justice framework around his policies, and he doesn't. You know, he talks about the racial wealth gap because he just learned about, you know, the burning and the massacre that happened in Tulsa. And I'm thinking to myself, you're supposed to be an incredibly smart man, right? A multi-billionaire over and over again. So the idea that you're just learning about how these policies were traumatic to an entire generation of people, I find problematic and incredibly disingenuous. And I want to see his policies that he's going to put forward that are actually going to remedy what he did in New York City.
You know,
How much? I was going right to you, Don, because you nearly fell over with that answer.
I did. And, you know, I have dear friends on the Bloomberg campaign. But the thing that I don't think that Mike Bloomberg gets, if you hear him talk about that, he ultimately continues to come around to, but we did bring down crime. No, man, that's unacceptable. There are other ways to bring down crime. Police accountability, community policing measures, give them books and love and attention. That's how you bring down crime, not pulling over Black folks like myself and throwing them up against the wall. His term, not mine. And there's actually no way to repair the damage that's ever been done, because you would have to go find 100,000 Black and brown men and go find and remediate their records. How many of them lost jobs? How many of them lost child care and custody because of the criminal records that emanated from unconstitutional stop and frisk? There's no way to fix it. And sitting down with Reverend Al or any other black leaders simply doesn't get it done. And that's not a knock on Mike Bloomberg. That's just a knock on a really bad racist policy.
So what will get it done, Susan, with regard to, say, the debate when he's asked about this? Because you can pretty much bet he will be.
Well, when it comes to the debate, I actually agree with the two other guests. He doesn't have a very good answer, so he's got to pivot off of it. He's got to stick with the apology. I'm not suggesting that it's sufficient. I'm saying a good debate strategy is to pivot off of it, because that's the only hope he has. He cannot explain it away. It just doesn't work. And I think, yes, he could talk about other policies he wants to bring forward and work within the community, but that's not going to all happen in the debate. So when he's there on Tuesday night, he's got to be able to pivot off of that question, frankly.
Okay. Danielle, Dawn, and Susan, always good to see all three of you. Thank you so much, guys.